Grandpa taught me how to back a trailered boat into the water when I was 13. He had been standing on the small wooden dock at the boatyard with one hand on his hip and the other one waving at me, slowly, as I had been turning the wheel of his old gray pickup truck the wrong direction every time he had told me which direction was correct. He had been patient. He had not raised his voice once. He had told me, when I had finally backed the boat in cleanly, that the thing about reversing a trailer was that the wheel went the opposite way your brain wanted it to, and that most people gave up before they figured out how to override the brain. He had told me I had not given up. He had said this had been an important fact about me. He had said it as if he had been making a note in his head. I had not understood, at 13, that he had been making a note in his head. I had thought he had been giving me a small compliment about driving a truck. I would understand, almost 20 years later, sitting in the small front office of the boatyard at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, what he had actually been doing those summers I had been driving the truck. He had been auditioning me. He had been doing it carefully, in the small, generous way he had done most things, without telling me I had been auditioning, because he had not wanted me to perform. I am going to tell you what he eventually offered me. I am going to tell you what I did with the offer. I am going to tell you what was on the small slip of paper the lawyer pulled out at the will reading, the line my grandfather had added the week before he died, which had made my father stand up at the conference table and stare at me as if he had been seeing me for the first time in his life. And I am going to tell you what my father did 3 minutes after that, which had not been what most family stories tell you to expect, and which had taught me more about my father in 3 minutes than I had learned in the 36 years I had been his daughter. Before I do, hit subscribe. And tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about an older person in your life who had been quietly preparing you, for years, for a job they had not yet told you was going to be yours. Tell me whether you had figured out, at the time, what they had been doing. Tell me what the job turned out to be. I read every single comment. Now let me take you back to my grandfather's boatyard, because the boatyard is the whole story. I am Marisol Esposito. I am 38 years old. I am the general manager of a small marina and boatyard on the coast of Maine. The business is called Esposito and Daughter. The name went up on the sign 3 months ago. The painter who painted it, a man named Jonas, had been a friend of my grandfather's for 40 years and had cried while he had been painting the word daughter, because he had known what the word was replacing. The word had been replacing my father's name. The replacing had not been my idea. The replacing had been a long story, which I want to tell you in the order it actually happened. My grandfather was Aurelio Esposito. He had been born in 1942 in a small fishing town in southern Italy, and had emigrated to coastal Maine in 1958 when he had been 16, with his parents and his 3 brothers. The family had come to Maine because a cousin of my great-grandfather had been working on lobster boats out of a small harbor, and had told them there had been work. My grandfather had spent his first 8 years in this country working on lobster boats and on fishing crews. By the time he had been 24, he had saved enough money to buy a small piece of waterfront property at the edge of a sheltered harbor north of Portland. He had built a small dock by himself the first year. He had bought a used boat lift the second year. By the 3rd year, he had been hauling and repairing small fishing boats and pleasure craft for everybody in our region. By the time he had been 40, the boatyard had grown to 3 buildings, 2 travel lifts, a small machine shop, and a service department with 6 employees. The boatyard had been the most important thing in my grandfather's life. I want you to understand that. He had loved my grandmother Lucia, who had been a quiet, patient woman who had run the small office and the books for 40 years. He had loved his 3 children, my father Renato, my aunt Bianca, and my uncle Marco. He had loved his grandchildren. He had loved the small parish church where he had served on the building committee for 30 years. But the boatyard had been the thing he had built with his own hands, and the boatyard had been the thing he had been quietly worried about for the last 15 years of his life, because none of his children had wanted to take it over. My father had been the oldest of the 3 children. He had been expected to take over. He had not wanted to. He had become a financial advisor in his 20s, had moved to Boston, had built a small, successful practice, and had told my grandfather, when he had been 28, that he was not going to come back to run the boatyard. My grandfather had been disappointed. He had not pushed. He had assumed for years that my uncle Marco would eventually step up. My uncle Marco had become a teacher, had moved to California, and had been even more emphatic than my father. My aunt Bianca had married a man who had moved her to Pennsylvania. None of the 3 children had wanted the boatyard. I had been the only grandchild who had spent her summers at the boatyard. I want you to understand this too. My brother Tobias, who was 3 years younger than me, had spent his summers at a sailing camp my mother had sent him to. My cousins, my Aunt Bianca's two daughters, had spent their summers in Pennsylvania. My Uncle Marco's children had been raised in California and had visited Maine only once or twice in their lives. The grandchildren had been spread out. The grandchildren had not been part of the boatyard. Except me. My mother had been a teacher. My mother had not been able to afford summer camps for both me and Tobias. My father had insisted Tobias go to the sailing camp because he had wanted Tobias to learn to sail, which was a thing my father associated with the kind of life he had built for himself in Boston. My mother had told me, when I had been 10 and had been complaining about not being included in the sailing camp, that I could spend my summers at my grandfather's boatyard if I wanted to. I had said yes, in the casual way 10-year-olds say yes to things they do not yet understand the consequences of. My parents had driven me up to the small apartment my grandparents had built above the boatyard's main office in 1972, and they had left me there for the summer. I had spent every summer at the boatyard from when I had been 10 to when I had been 18. 9 summers. The summers had been the foundation of everything that happened later. I want to tell you what my grandfather had been doing during those 9 summers, because I had not understood the doing until much later. He had been teaching me the business. He had not been teaching me with lessons. He had been teaching me by giving me small jobs and letting me figure out how to do them. The first summer, when I had been 10, I had answered the phone in the office. By 11, I had been writing up small invoices on the carbon paper triplicate forms my grandmother had been using since 1968. By 12, I had been scheduling haul-outs in the small spiral notebook my grandfather had kept on his desk. By 13, I had been backing trailered boats into the water. By 14, I had been running the parts counter on Saturdays. By 15, I had been authorizing small purchase orders. By 16, I had been ordering supplies. By 17, I had been doing the payroll for the 6 service employees under my grandmother's supervision. By 18, I had been writing the quarterly reports my grandfather had been showing to his accountant. I had not understood at the time that I had been learning the business. I had thought my grandfather had been giving me jobs because the office had been short-staffed in the summers, and because I had been a useful pair of hands. I had thought he had been doing me a favor by including me. I had not thought I had been doing him a favor by being there. He had been doing both. He had been teaching me. He had been doing it for me, and he had been doing it for the business, and he had been doing it because he had figured out, by the time I had been about 13, that I was the only person in his family who was going to be capable of running the boatyard after he was gone. I had gone away to college at 18. I had studied business administration at a small state school in Maine, with a concentration in operations management. I had not chosen the major because of the boatyard. I had chosen it because I had been good at it, and because I had not known what else I had wanted to do. After college, I had taken a job at a small logistics company in Portland for 4 years. I had been good at it. I had been promoted twice. I had also been bored. When I had been 26, my grandmother Lucia had died. I want to tell you about my grandmother's death because the death is when the rest of the story started. My grandmother had been 74. She had been in good health up until the final 6 weeks. She had died of complications from a fall in the small apartment above the office. My grandfather had been 78 at the time. He had been devastated. He had also been, very suddenly, alone in the business he had been running for 45 years, without the woman who had been managing the books and the office and the small daily details for the entire history of the boatyard. I had taken a week off work for the funeral. I had stayed at the boatyard with my grandfather. I had helped him sort through some of my grandmother's office paperwork. I had been getting ready to drive back to Portland on a Sunday evening when my grandfather had asked me, in the small, careful voice he used when he was about to ask for something difficult, whether I would be willing to come back to the boatyard for a few months to help him with the office until he could find somebody to hire. I had said yes. I had not thought about it for very long. I had been 26. I had been bored at my logistics job. I had loved my grandfather. I had told my employer the next morning that I needed to take a leave of absence for family reasons. I had moved back into the small apartment above the office that evening. I had thought I was going to be there for 3 months. I had been there for the next 4 years. I want to tell you what happened during those 4 years, because the 4 years are the work of the story. The first 3 months, I had handled the office. I had answered phones. I had written invoices. I had paid bills. I had managed the small payroll. The work had been the same work I had been doing at 15 and 17, with a few more zeros on the numbers and a few more decades of paperwork to keep straight. I had not minded. I had been good at it. At the end of the 3 months, my grandfather had asked me to stay for another 3. He had told me he had not found anyone to hire. He had told me he had also not been looking very hard. He had asked me if I would consider staying on as the office manager, with a small raise from what I had been making in Portland, and the apartment included as part of the compensation. I had said yes again. I had been 26 and a half. I had told my employer in Portland I was not coming back. At the end of the next 6 months, my grandfather had asked me to take over the bookkeeping entirely. He had told me he had been wanting to step back from the financial side of the business. He had been 78 and a half. He had been tired. He had told me he trusted me. I had said yes. At the end of the next year, when I had been 28, my grandfather had asked me to start managing the service department too. He had told me the service manager, a man named Henrik who had been with the Boatyard for 31 years, had been getting close to retirement, and that he wanted me to learn the operations side before Henrik left. He had told me I would be a kind of assistant operations manager. He had given me a raise. I had said yes. By the time I had been 30, I had been managing both the office and the service department. Henrik had retired. I had been promoted in title to operations manager. My grandfather had been 82. He had been coming into the Boatyard about 3 days a week, mostly to walk around and to talk to the customers who had been with us for decades. He had not been doing any of the actual management work. He had been handing it off. By the time I had been 32, I had been running the entire Boatyard. I want to be precise about what this means. I had been making every operational decision. I had been hiring and firing. I had been negotiating with suppliers. I had been managing the relationships with the marina customers. I had been planning the capital improvements. I had been signing the checks. My grandfather had been the owner on paper. I had been the manager in every way that mattered. I want to tell you what my father had been doing during those 4 years. He had been visiting the Boatyard about twice a year. He had been talking to my grandfather on the phone every few weeks. He had not been involved in the operations. He had been telling people in Boston, where his financial advisory practice had been, that he had been managing the Boatyard remotely, and that he had been planning to eventually move back to Maine to take it over when the time came. He had been telling this story for years. The story had not been true. The story had also not been a thing I had been correcting publicly, because my grandfather had asked me very specifically not to. I want to tell you what my grandfather had said. He had told me, on the porch of the Boatyard's main office, on an afternoon in the spring of the year I had been 33, that he had been letting my father tell the story because he had been waiting to make a decision about the succession. He had told me he had been weighing 2 options. The first option had been to leave the Boatyard to my father, who would have either kept me on as the manager indefinitely or, more likely, sold the Boatyard within 5 years for his own retirement. The second option had been to leave the Boatyard to me, and to deal with whatever the family fallout was going to be after his death. He had told me he was still thinking. He had told me he was sorry I had been operating in the limbo. He had told me he loved me and that he was proud of the work I had been doing. I had told him I understood. I had told him I would respect whatever he decided. I had told him I did not need to inherit the Boatyard. I had told him I had been happy running it, and that I had wanted him to do what would be best for the family. He had nodded. He had patted my hand. He had not told me that afternoon what he had eventually decided. He had been still weighing. My grandfather had died 8 months after that conversation. He had died at 85 years old, in his sleep, in the small apartment above the office. I had been the one who had found him. I had gone up to bring him his morning coffee, the way I had been doing for the last 6 years, and he had not been breathing. He had died of natural causes. The coroner had estimated he had been gone for about 3 hours. I want to tell you about the week before he died, because the week is when he had finally made his decision. He had called the family lawyer, a man named Mr. Octavian Lindqvist, who had been my grandfather's attorney for 36 years. He had asked Mr. Lindqvist to come to the Boatyard for a meeting. The meeting had been on a Wednesday afternoon. I had been in the meeting. I had not known going into the meeting what it was going to be about. My grandfather had told Mr. Lindqvist, in the small office above the office, that he wanted to make a small change to his will. He had told him the change was a single line. He had told him the line was about who was going to manage the Boatyard during the transition period after his death. The original will had left the Boatyard to my father. My grandfather had decided, during my 4 years of running it, that this would have been the wrong thing to do. He had also decided, after long conversations with himself and with Mr. Lindqvist over the months before his death, that the right thing was not necessarily to leave it to me outright. The right thing, in his judgment, was to do something more careful, that would let me prove the case I had already been proving, and that would give my father a chance to either accept the reality of the situation or to make himself look foolish in the process. He had decided to add a single line to the will. The line, which I would hear read out loud at the will reading 3 weeks after his death, said the following. It said, "The boatyard and all of its operations, equipment, and inventory shall remain under the management of Marisol Esposito, who has been the operations manager for 4 years, and who is therefore the only person in the family with the knowledge to run the business, for a period of 24 months after my death. During this 24-month period, ownership of the boatyard cannot be transferred to any family member. At the end of the 24 months, the boatyard will be appraised at fair market value, and Marisol Esposito will be given the right of first refusal to purchase the business from the estate, with the purchase price to be financed through a private note from the estate over a 15-year period at an interest rate not to exceed 2% above prime. If Marisol Esposito declines the right of first refusal, the boatyard will then be offered to other family members in the following order: Renato Esposito, Bianca Esposito Marchand, Marco Esposito. If none of the family members elect to purchase the business, it will be sold to an outside buyer with the proceeds distributed equally to my 3 children." That was the line. 1 paragraph. He had added it the Wednesday before he died. He had signed the updated will. Mr. Lindquist had filed it. My grandfather had not told anybody in the family that he had updated the will. He had told me, very briefly, on the morning before he died, that he had made a change to the will that I would learn about at the reading, and that he hoped I would understand why he had done what he had done, and that he was proud of me. He had said this while he had been pouring his coffee at the small kitchen counter in the apartment. He had not made a speech. He had simply mentioned it, casually, the way he had been mentioning things to me for 28 years. I had not pressed him. I had assumed I would find out at the reading. I had been right about that. The will reading was 3 weeks after the funeral. The reading was at Mr. Lindquist's office in town. The whole family had come. My father had flown up from Boston. My Aunt Bianca had flown up from Pennsylvania. My Uncle Marco had flown in from California. My mother had been there. My brother Tobias had been there. Mr. Lindquist had read the will in his small, careful voice. The will had been straightforward for most of its length. Small bequests to the parish, the apartment furnishings to my Aunt Bianca, who had asked for them, the fishing gear to my Uncle Marco, the truck to me, which had not been a surprise, because my grandfather had been telling me for years he was going to leave me the truck. Then Mr. Lindquist had gotten to the boatyard. He had read the new paragraph. He had read it slowly, with the careful enunciation he had been using for the whole reading. The paragraph had taken about 90 seconds to read. I want to tell you about the silence in the room when he had finished. The silence had been the silence of people processing information they had not expected. My father had been sitting across the table from me. He had been wearing a dark gray suit. He had been holding a pen he had brought with him, in case there had been paperwork to sign. He had been looking at Mr. Lindquist while the paragraph had been read. When Mr. Lindquist had finished, my father had not moved for about 3 seconds. Then he had set the pen down on the table. Then he had stood up. I had been bracing for what he was going to say. I had been thinking, in those 3 seconds, of all the things he might have said. He might have said the change was a forgery. He might have said the change was invalid because of undue influence on my grandfather's part. He might have said that I had manipulated my grandfather into changing the will. He might have called for a recess to consult his own attorney. He might have said any number of things that would have started a small family war that would have lasted years. He did not say any of those things. He had stood up. He had looked at me across the table. He had been quiet for a long moment. Then he had said, in a voice I had not heard him use before, "Marisol, I owe you an apology." I had not been ready for that. I want to tell you I had been ready for everything else. I had not been ready for that. He had said, "I have been telling people in Boston for years that I had been managing the boatyard remotely. I have been telling them I had been planning to come back and take it over. I have been telling people, including my own clients, that the boatyard was something I had been building for the family. I had been telling these things to people because I had wanted to seem like a particular kind of son to my father, and because I had wanted to seem like a particular kind of older brother to your aunt and your uncle. I had been telling these things in front of you for years. You had been the one actually doing the work. You had been the one running the place. I had been the one telling the story. I had been doing this in front of you, and you had let me, and I had taken your silence as permission. It had not been permission. It had been respect for my father, who had asked you to let me have the story until he died. He had told me 3 years ago that he had asked you to do this. I had not known until just now what he had been planning to do at the end of it. I want you to know I am not going to challenge this. I am not going to challenge any of it. I want you to have what he has given you. I want you to know I have known for years that you had been the right person for the boatyard. I had been hoping he would give it to me anyway. He has done the right thing. I want you to know I see that. I am sorry. I am genuinely sorry. I will get out of your way. I had not been able to speak. I had been crying. I had not been crying because I had won anything. I had been crying because my father had just given me, in the small, awkward way men of his generation give difficult things, the only kind of apology I had ever heard him give to anybody. The apology had been more than I had been expecting to get from him in this lifetime. The apology had also been, in a way I had not been able to articulate in the moment, the gift he had been holding in reserve for me, that my grandfather had been counting on him to eventually give. My grandfather had been hoping, when he had added the line about the 24 months, that my father would do exactly what my father had just done. My grandfather had given my father the room to make a different choice than the choice my father had been pretending he was going to make for 20 years. My father had taken the room. He had made the choice. My Aunt Bianca had been crying too. She had reached across the table and had taken my hand. My Uncle Marco had been looking at the floor. My mother had been looking at my father with an expression I had not seen on her face before, which had been a kind of slow relief at watching her husband become a different version of himself in real time. My brother Tobias had been smiling, in the small, careful way he smiled at family events, and had nodded at me. He had told me later in the parking lot that he had been hoping for years that this was how it would go, and that he had not had the words to say it before, but that he had been on my side the whole time. I want to tell you what has happened in the year since, because the year is the part of the story that I have been carrying most carefully. The 24-month transition period is still running. I am about halfway through it. The boatyard is doing well. We have grown our service revenue by 11%. We have added 2 new employees. We have started a small program for teaching teenage girls boat handling, repair, and operations on Saturday mornings, which was the part of my grandfather's life I had been wanting to honor most directly. There are 7 girls in the first cohort. The oldest is 15. The youngest is 11. The 11-year-old, a girl named Liesel, has reminded me, in small specific ways, of the version of myself I had been on the dock at 13 with the trailered boat. I have been teaching her how to back it in. She has been getting it more quickly than I did. She has not given up. I have been making notes about her in my head. My father and I have been talking once a week on the phone. The conversations have been awkward, in the way conversations are awkward when 2 people who have not really been honest with each other for decades are starting to be honest. We have been getting better. He has visited the boatyard 3 times in the last year. He has been polite. He has been quiet. He has not been performing. He has been asking real questions about the business. He has been listening to my answers. He has, on his most recent visit, brought a folder of suggestions for tax structuring that he had been working on with one of his colleagues in Boston, that I had not asked him for, but that had been useful, and that I had thanked him for. We have been finding a way to be in each other's lives that is not the way we had been before. The new way is slower and quieter and less pretending. I think it is better. My mother has been spending more time at the boatyard. She has been helping me with the small Saturday morning program for the girls. She has been packing snacks. She has been driving them home when their parents could not pick them up. She has been, in the way mothers become things they had not planned to become, the kind of grandmother figure for the girls in the program that I had been hoping somebody in their lives would be. She has been good at it. She has been telling me, on the way home from the program every Saturday, that she had not known she had been wanting to do this. I want to tell you what I have learned because I have been thinking about it for the last year, and I want to give it to you carefully. The first thing I have learned is that some people in your family will spend years telling a story about you that is the opposite of what you have been doing, and the story will hurt you, and the hurting will accumulate, and you will spend nights lying in bed thinking about whether to correct the story. Most of the time, you should not correct the story. The story is not yours to correct. The story belongs to the person telling it. If you correct it directly, you will get into an argument that will not end, because the story is doing something for the person telling it that has nothing to do with the truth. You cannot argue somebody out of a story that is doing important work for them. You can only outlast it. The outlasting takes years. The outlasting is hard. The outlasting is also, in most cases, the only thing that works. The proof of the actual story is the work you have been doing while the false story has been being told. The work is the answer. The work will eventually be visible. The visibility may take a long time. The visibility may not arrive until after somebody dies, and a lawyer reads a single line out loud in a small office in your hometown, and the person who had been telling the false story has the chance to make a different choice about it. You cannot make the choice for them. They have to choose. Sometimes they will choose well. Sometimes they will not. Either way, you will know by the time the moment arrives that you have been the one doing the work, and the work will not need any further confirmation from anybody, because the work is its own confirmation. And the work is what you will be carrying forward into the next decade of your life, regardless of what anybody says about it. The second thing I have learned is that the people who have been training you for a job, without telling you they are training you, are sometimes doing it because they have been waiting to see if you are the kind of person who can be trained without performing. The training is the gift. The not telling you about the training is also the gift. The two gifts together are what make the training stick. If your grandfather sits you down at 13 and says, "Marisol, I am going to teach you how to run this business because I think you are going to take it over from me," you will start performing immediately. You will start trying to be the kind of person who is being trained to take over. The performance will get in the way of the learning. The learning will be smaller than it would have been. The grandfather who is wise enough to know this will simply put you on the dock with a trailered boat at 13 and will see what you do. He will see how patient you are. He will see how you handle frustration. He will see whether you give up. He will not tell you he is watching. He will not tell you the watching is the audition. He will let the watching be quiet. By the time you are 26 and your grandmother dies and he asks you to come back for 3 months, he will have already known, for years, that you are the one. The asking will not be a beginning. The asking will be the next step in something that started 13 years earlier, when you were 13 and you were figuring out how to turn the wheel the opposite direction your brain wanted it to go. The third thing I have learned, and the last one I want to give you, is that the family members who have been performing a different story than the one you have been actually living can sometimes, given the right moment, set the performance down. The setting down is not guaranteed. Most family members will continue to perform the story until the day they die, because the performance is doing too much work for them to give up. But some family members, given the right kind of moment, will look at the actual truth in front of them and will decide in real time to be different. My father did this at the will reading. He did this in 3 seconds, after standing up, after looking at me across the table. He did it because my grandfather had given him the room to do it. The room was the 24-month clause. The clause had been the structure that had made my father's choice possible. If my grandfather had simply left the boatyard to me outright, my father would have had to challenge the will to maintain his story. He would have done it. He would have lost a lot of money and a lot of pride trying to do it, and the family would have been broken for years. By leaving the management to me for 24 months, and by giving my father the chance to either accept the obvious truth or to spend 2 years pretending it was not the truth, my grandfather had built my father a small door he could walk through if he chose to. My father had walked through it. He had walked through it in 3 seconds. The door had been there because my grandfather had built it. The walking through had been my father's choice. The combination had been what had saved the family. If you are about to face a moment with somebody in your family who has been telling a wrong story about you for years, please consider whether you can build them a door. The door is not a forgiveness in advance. The door is just the structure that lets them, if they choose to, do the right thing in the moment without losing everything they had been performing. Most people, when given a small, graceful door, will eventually walk through it. The walking through will not undo the years. The walking through will start the years after. The years after can be different. The years after, in my family, have been different. The new years are not the years I had been planning to live. The new years are better than the years I had been planning to live. The dooring of my father, by my grandfather, was the most generous thing I have ever seen anybody in my family do for another person. The generosity has been compounding. The compounding is the inheritance. The boatyard is the inheritance too, but the boatyard is just the building. The dooring is the bigger thing. The dooring is what I want to learn how to do for the people I love in the rest of my life. I want to ask you something before you go. Tell me in the comments about a moment when somebody in your family built a small door for another family member to walk through, so that the family member could make a better choice than the one they had been performing for years. Tell me who built the door. Tell me who walked through. Tell me whether you have been able to learn from it. Tell me whether you have been able to build a small door for somebody yourself since then, in your own family or in your own life. The dooring is not a thing most families talk about. Most families do not realize they have been built or saved by people who quietly built small doors for the right family members at the right moments. I have been thinking about doors for a year now. I would like to know about yours. I will be reading every single comment. I will see you in the next one.